If it's done and you keep going, you mess it up. You ruin it. It's like overbaking a cake or overcooking a steak. You ruin what could have been amazing had you stopped at the right moment and paid attention to when it was done, when you need to take that cake out or the steak off the grill.
Welcome to The Third Story. I'm your host, Leo Sidran. You are a human being, and that was recording engineer Ryan Hewitt on the art of grilling steak. Ryan Hewitt is a recording and mix engineer based in Nashville. He grew up in a recording family. His dad, Dave Hewitt, was one of the great mobile engineers who worked with hundreds of artists on some of the most important live recordings ever made. Ryan started in the business of recording when he was still a kid and started paying his dues before he could even cash a check. Despite his early experience, he started working in studios from the bottom and worked his way up in the New York studio scene in the 1990s, in a very traditional way that is harder and harder to come by these days. In those early years, he assisted and recorded on dozens of incredible recordings, working next to some of the greatest engineers and producers in New York. But eventually he moved to LA, and his career shifted into yet another gear. In the LA years, he worked on some brilliant records with Rick Rubin, the Red Hot Chili Peppers, Blink-182, and many more. But then a few years ago, he moved once again, this time to, you guessed it, Nashville. Man, so many people are moving to Nashville, it almost makes me wonder if I should move there. Ryan set himself up in the Berry Hill area, which is apparently basically one giant recording studio with various front doors and driveways. And he's been going strong, working on projects with the Avett Brothers, Third Eye Blind, Harry Connick, and the Lumineers. Ryan is a bridge between the old school and the new school. In our conversation, he talks about all of the tradition he came out of and how it informed his approach today. I've posted some examples of Ryan's work on the Third Story website, so when you go there to subscribe or leave a review, you can also hang out and dig on some groovy sounds. It's third-story.com. Before we get started with the conversation, let me play you a little taste of the song Ophelia from that most recent Lumineers record, recorded and mixed by Ryan.
When I was younger, I should have known better, and I can't feel no remorse, and you don't feel nothing back. I got a new girlfriend. He feels like he's on top, and I don't feel no remorse, and you can't see past my blindness. Oh, Ophelia, you've been on my mind, girl, since the flood. Heaven help a fool who falls in love.
Ryan Hewitt, thank you for taking time with me this morning.
Oh, my pleasure.
We were going to maybe talk yesterday, and then a mix came up. You wrote to me and said that you got a gig.
Oh, yeah, well, you know, these things come about, hopefully.
What does your life look like in that regard?
I mean, you can't really plan anything. Murphy's Law rears its head all the time. It's like, as soon as I book a trip, I get a gig. Yeah. For the dates of that trip. Even if it's 6 months from now, someone will want that particular day or week or whatever.
And what do? You
say no. I've planned my trip. I've planned my life. I can do it the week before. I can do it the week after. I can do it any time between now and then, and from then after.
How long has it taken you to get to the point where you permit yourself to say no to opportunity?
I still cringe when I do it. And then I have to remember that, like so many things, gigs come and go, and you can't do all of them. As much as I would love to cover every single thing that I get called for, it's just not possible. Sometimes financially, sometimes spiritually, whatever, you know, physically. Sometimes you just got to let it go, and sometimes it just doesn't work for you.
How does that compare to the mentality around work that you saw growing up?
You know, my father was a recording engineer, retired pretty much. But he did all live recordings, so he'd run around with his mobile studio, his trucks and his flight packs, and record anything, anywhere, for the most part. And so he always had this attitude of, like, the gig's not on until I'm there. You know, he would have everything booked, maybe they'd send a deposit, but he had this sort of superstition about talking about a gig before we went out, to the point where his employees didn't know sometimes until they were like, all right, get in the truck, let's go now, you know. He sort of had this thing, because things would come and go, and people would send checks and deposits, and then be like, oh, we need our money back, you know, it's actually off, this thing fell through, the licensing or the blah, blah, blah agreements fell through. So, you know, he had that superstition. I've done my best to overcome that. I just sort of have to have a faith in myself and in, you know, whatever you want to call it, the universe, to bring me the good stuff when I need it. As soon as, and I've also had this thing where I used to get really uptight about being slow or having nothing booked or whatever, and I still do. It's like it's this internal battle I have. But I found that when I relax and forget about it and just go about doing the things that I want to do, like working on a car, taking the dog for a walk, or, you know, gardening at my house, or doing some repairs or whatever, doing some repairs in the studio, listening to music, all these things that I want to do that are not work, I do those things. And of course, as soon as I get engrossed in that, then I get a phone call, and then I have all these projects sitting in my barn that are unfinished. I go through periods where I work so much that I forget what I like to do outside of work. Mm-hmm. And so I have to keep lists of the things that I need to do or want to do outside the studio.
It's funny that the way you answered the question about the difference between how your dad approached that kind of thing and how you do, because really what I was thinking about was, with a recording truck, the truck is as much the asset as the operators. And I would imagine that once you assembled that truck and put that thing together, you know, you wouldn't want to say no to a gig.
Yeah, well, I mean, he didn't say no to gigs.
Right.
Really. I mean, you know, my parents ran the business together. My mother usually sort of dealt with the inquiries and bookings and money and things like that. Of course, if he's available, he's going to take the gig. Yeah. There's not a question. He also had 3 children and a wife to feed and a house to manage and stuff like that. I have things fairly easy as that goes. Mm-hmm. But the thing about, you know, like you say like the, you know, the truck and my dad, like the truck is a manifestation of how he works and how he thinks about things. He certainly had probably the most state-of-the-art analog truck ever built. You know, you could patch to and from anywhere, digitally, analog, you know, Cat 5. Anything you could possibly put down a wire can get from anywhere to anywhere in the truck, and from outside to inside, inside to outside. Mm-hmm. And that's sort of informed how I set up my studio. Even though I'm in a, you know, somewhat permanent facility, all my stuff's still in road cases, so that if someone says, I want to make a record at my house, and I want you to do it, and I want to start next week, I can unplug all this stuff, pack it up into a truck in a few hours, and have it at someone's house, and set it up, you know, in a day. Before we get into more current projects, I do want to just talk a little bit about your memory of what this work looked like when you were a kid, and how much of it was technical, how much of it was the people, what attracted you to it, and what you take from that time in your life. I can remember going to recording studios with my dad when I was, I mean, as far back as I can think, you know, 4 years old, maybe 5 years old, going to the record plant in New York. So that would have been 1979-ish, 78, 79, 80. I just remember the people who were around my dad, because they were all like my dad. They're all these big, you know, beardy dudes, and, you know, that was the family friends, all the techs and engineers. The people were always the most fun, and of course, you know, learning to play drums a little bit when I was a kid. One of the engineers at record plant like sat me on his lap and showed me how to play, you know, a little kick snare hat beat on Billy Cobham's drum kit, I think. Mm-hmm. You know, it was just like a fun vibe, and of course it was Dad, so you want to be around what your dad does, I suppose, at that age. And it just sort of stuck. I worked for him starting when I was 12 or 13, and was going on the road working 18-hour days as a kid, like a sweatshop kind of thing.
Child labor laws.
Child labor laws. Where are they at? You know, so I've been working 18-hour days since I was 13, and I always just thought that was cool and like macho and very manly to, you know, do these things, do these long days, set up from scratch, starting at 8 o'clock in the morning, running the cable, setting up the mics, doing the split, doing the show, doing the loadout, going back to the hotel at like 2 in the morning, getting up and doing it again the next day. It was just like, it was life. That's all I knew. It's all I've ever known. I've never had a job really outside of something music related.
Considering you saw how the sausage got made from an early age, how do you think that affected the way you listened to music as you were learning to love music in your own way?
I didn't really get exposed to the sausage making that is studio recording until I was like, 21.
Mm-hmm.
No, like 19, 20 maybe, when I had an internship at a studio in New York. Prior to that, it was just show up, record the stuff, send it off just for someone else to mix. I always asked my dad when I was a kid, like when I got really into Led Zeppelin and the Beatles and stuff in junior high and high school, I was like, Dad, why don't you want to go in the studio and like record an album like this? This is the greatest thing ever made. And he's like, I don't need to hear the same guitar solo 1,000 times. Yeah, just don't want to do that. I want to record something, capture that moment, hand the tapes off, walk on to the next thing.
I think that there's something technically intrinsic to being a mobile recording person or a live recording person, and maybe, and this is part of what I wondered, is it just a disposition, just a personality thing? Because it's very different, and ultimately you've become very focused on the final product and the end result. Your dad's truck was there to just passively essentially capture it, right, and make as few choices as possible along the way.
Yeah, well, my dad, is a very particular, hardworking, job-oriented, very focused individual, and he just wanted to capture the moment perfectly, no issues, and move on. And that was his reputation. It still is. I can think of one instance in the entire time I've known him, so 42 years, that there was a fuck up that could have been avoided, and it was just he missed the patch. He moved it one hole over from where it should have been, and something didn't get recorded for about a minute until people were like, oh, where is that thing? And it's like, oh shit, that's the only thing that I can think of that ever got messed up. And because of his sort of passive capture, as you say, I've become a lot more aggressive in that department. Like I EQ the hell out of things to tape, and I'll compress things. I'm not afraid of any of that stuff. It's a challenge of coming out from under your successful father. I talk about him in interviews, and I talk about him with friends and stuff, but there have been several distinct moments throughout my life where someone has called me out for talking about my dad too much. My dad this, my dad that. They're like, oh, no one fucking cares about your dad. I'm like, oh, okay. And I stopped talking about him. That was like in 9th grade. Someone yelled at me, a friend of mine. And I was like, oh, all right. And then I got in the studio, and I never talked about him. He would be like the ace up my sleeve. If a session was going a little weird, I'd be like, hey, I think you've worked with my father before, haven't you? There was some producer I worked with who was just being a total asshole in a session. And he was just sort of shitting all over me and being just a grumpy old man. And I brought up my dad, and all of a sudden his frown turned upside down, and he became like this happy guy. And he was like, "Oh, I had no idea." And then all of a sudden I was his best friend, and the session went on. I never had to say it again, but it was just something I pulled out. Like, maybe this will help this situation.
You describe experiencing the studio characters, the engineers and the tech people, but of course you're all working together with musicians to capture music as well. Did you feel any sort of divide between the two sides of the glass?
It was a huge divide, because there was, there could be half a mile between the truck and the stage. And my dad worked with all these incredible people, but most of the time didn't meet them. There were people he's worked with for forever. Like Neil Young, he's been working with since like 71 or 72 or something like that. He's met Neil a bunch of times. They're not friends by any stretch, but they know, Neil knows who my dad is and keeps calling him. And he's met the guys in the Stones and some stuff like that. But on the whole, he doesn't care. Like, he's not someone who gets off by meeting people, famous or not. Yeah. Like, his nickname on the road was the Lone Ranger, because we would be doing a gig and it'd be mealtime, and all of a sudden he'd be gone because he didn't want to eat dinner with anybody. He would go off by himself and just do his thing, or he'd grab me and we'd run off and go have dinner together by ourselves and not with the other 50 people on the crew or whatever. So it was an interesting upbringing in that regard, because I'm the total opposite. I'm someone who gets like massive energy boosts from being around people that I love and relate to, want to work with, or have a cultural connection with. That's sort of how I get off. And for me, even when I'm recording, I like the artist to be in the room with me whenever we can. Like if we're just doing a bass overdub, I'll have the bass player sit right where you are. Or a vocal overdub, I love having them in the room, so there's a direct line of communication.
Eventually you went on, you got an internship at a studio, you started working with a lot of other producers, you had the card up your sleeve if you needed to. But it seems to me you made a conscious decision to go through all of the stages that you had to go through when you got into the business of apprenticeship and assisting and basically the path of an engineer.
I think at a certain point it became the only thing I could think about. was to get in this chair that I'm sitting in right now. I didn't know exactly what that meant or exactly how to get there, but, you know, in the 90s, it was still like a very clear, quasi-linear path. You intern, you're a runner, you're an assistant, you're maybe a staff engineer, you're an engineer, you're starving a little bit, you're engineering, you're starving, you're mixing, you're producing. Well, at that point, I had no idea what the hell was going to happen. You know, I was still the low man on the totem pole making $5 an hour, you know.
But there wasn't really another way to do it.
I've heard of other people sort of jumping in at different levels. I mean, like my friend Bob Power, who's now a professor at NYU and an extremely successful, you know, engineer and mixer and producer and mastering engineer. He got a master's degree in music composition in San Francisco, I think, and by happenstance got into a recording studio, and all of a sudden he sort of became an engineer. Like, he never was an assistant or a runner or anything like that. He came at it from the musician side. And for me, you know, I went to school for electrical engineering, very technical background, because I thought that's what I needed to succeed. In retrospect, I wish I had gone to school for music, like not an engineering school, but like a music school. Like
Interesting.
Some kind of performance or writing course would have been a far more interesting approach. But yeah, I mean, you know, I got out of that. I interned in the tech shop at Sony Studios in New York and hung out with them and sort of moved up through the ranks at the studio.
What do you think made you a good assistant?
I wanted it really badly. I wanted to be around all the people. You know, I'd been around technical people my whole life. I had always been the kind of person who's like, what can I do? I don't want to sit here. Like, if I sit for more than a minute, I'm bored. You know, especially as a teenager and early 20s young man. I just wanted to be doing something all the time, helping somebody do something and learning something all the time.
See, as much as you say that it would have been interesting to have a musical education instead of a technical education, it sounds to me that you really loved all of those technical aspects and that you recognized that that was the work. I didn't do any of that stuff. I lasted a week as an assistant, I guess, at Smart in Madison, where I basically just had to write down all the recall settings on a mix, and I did that for a week, and I was like, I'm not going to do this.
This is not my bag.
This is not who I am.
Yeah.
But I realized that that was the day that I chose not to really become an engineer, a proper engineer, because I could see that the writing was on the wall. This is what you have to do.
Right.
You, it sounds like, not only did it, but did it eagerly and with excitement.
So I wound up through a race of attrition, I suppose. I wound up as Michael Brower's assistant because no one else wanted the gig. A combination of no one else wanted to work with him, and he didn't want to work with any of the other guys. He went through every single assistant in the studio, and I was the lowest man on the totem pole again as the bottom assistant. They threw me in there because I needed a bit of an ass kicking, and Brower kicked my butt, but it also inspired me to work really hard. And you talk about taking mix notes and stuff like that. The guy who was his previous assistant didn't really know how to organize things, and so there was just a mess of all these recall sheets, these little diagrams of all the gear that Michael used. And at the time he only had 2 racks. Now he's got like 6 or 7.
Right.
You know, it was the early days of, you know, having a laptop and Photoshop and things like that. So I went into the computer while I was sitting there and he was mixing, and I made all these sheets so all the gear looked like the rack.
Yeah.
And I could do my recalls incredibly efficiently and get everything done and make sure that I had everything on the sheet that he was using. And he'd change his rack, and I'd go in and I'd change my recall sheets, and you know, it'd just be everything in order. And he doesn't make it his business to necessarily look at my notes, but if he looked at it one day, he's like, "Did you do that?" I said, "Well, yeah, of course." It's like, "What? Huh?" I'm like, "Well, I want to do this as quickly and nicely and as perfectly as possible, so this is what needs to happen." He's like, "Well, that's great," you know. And you know, I had all these sheets and everything was in the computer. He could ask me like, "Hey, what did we use on that vocal sound 2 weeks ago?" "Oh, we used the distressor in parallel with the 1176 and da 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 da." Cool.
Meanwhile, you know everything that Michael Brower used on everything he did, and I think that's probably what was lost on me and would be lost on a lot of impatient kids, is that what you're seeing is every decision that gets made and every choice that somebody made.
I feel very fortunate to have come up when I did, and with the mentors that I had and still have. I still talk to these guys about what we're doing, because the only real way to learn this craft is to be in the room with somebody for an extended period of time to understand what's happening. And you know, these instructional videos are great. I've made them, all my friends have made them. You know, guys who are successful can make videos and show you a handful of things, but it's really hard to get inside the head of someone else and understand why they're doing that, what made them choose that. And even if I explain to you why I like that compressor or that EQ, that's that day at that particular moment. And another day on another song with the same instruments, it might be something else. And why is that? You know, is it my mood? Is it the, you know, phase of the moon? I don't know. But being around, particularly Michael Brower for 2 years of assisting, and Jim Scott for like a year and a half, and then small stints with like Elliot Shiner and Phil Ramone and Bob Power and all these other really, really talented, badass engineers, shaped a lot of the way I work. And all those guys, that's a study in contrast just between those 5 or 6 people. Completely different attitudes and methods and vibes in their music. So I was able to cherry pick methods from each of those guys.
And each of them is this kind of a stylist. I mean, I think in a lot of cases they work on very different kinds of music, and they have thumbprints that you can sort of identify. At what point did you start to develop your own sensibility, and is it difficult to develop a sound once you've kind of internalized everybody else's sound that you're working
No,
with?
I think that if you work for a handful of people, you sort of cherry pick your favorite things that each of those guys do.
Yeah.
You know, I don't want to mix like Michael. I don't want to mix like Jim. I don't want to mix like Elliot. But I really admire and respect what they're doing, how they do it, and why.
Yeah.
You know, they each have their own sort of thing from the people that they worked with long before. You know, and in the case of Michael, he's been mixing records for 30 or 35 years, something like that. So he's developed this whole catalog of tricks and processes to make things sound the way he wants. And there's definitely a touchstone in Michael's mixes that you could, like, yeah, that's Michael, but it's like, it's Michael doing this. It's Michael mixing this person or that person.
It's not the Michael kick drum sound necessarily.
No, I mean, there are certain people who use the same damn samples over and over and over again, and they don't change their gear, and it's all the same. It's like that's truly a sausage factory to me. I don't work like that. I spend way too much time on my mixes, you know, and play with too many things for it to sound like, you know, a Ryan Hewitt mix. What's a Ryan Hewitt mix? I have no idea.
I have some thoughts. One thing that surprised me as I was looking at your discography, not the one that's on your website, but the one on All Music that lists all of your assisting gigs as well, or a lot of them.
There's some embarrassing ones on there.
There's some brilliant ones, though. I mean, what I didn't expect to see was so many of the... Because I came out of a kind of a jazz headspace when I was in college, and the number of records that were informative to me that you assisted on. Brad Mehldau, Art of the Trio record.
Man.
The Roots Come Alive record. I mean, they're very different kinds of things, but particularly when I saw the series of jazz records, probably the Farber stuff.
Oh man, that was so much fun.
What I recognize in a lot of your contemporary mixes is how open and wide they are, and how you're not afraid to move stuff around the stereo field in a way that I don't recognize in a lot of other mixes.
Oh, it's interesting. I definitely have an organic tendency in my mixes. I mean, you know, I'll process the hell out of things and, you know, send things through all sorts of weird filters and
right,
whatnot.
It's not a...
mangle them up. But certainly as a producer and things that I'm in charge of, I tend towards organic feel. And that does come from a lot of jazz. My father is a huge jazz head.
Yeah.
When I met James Farber, another phenomenal engineer and mixer, we just got along really well. I understood how he worked. I could keep up with him because he moves fast. And it got to the point where I would look at the schedule in the studio months ahead of time, months and months, because the jazz sessions would book far in advance. You know, they'd have everything planned out with everyone's schedule and whatnot. And, you know, I would call James and be like, hey, you know, I see you're coming in a few weeks. Would you mind calling the studio manager and requesting me? Because I'd really love to work on that record.
Yeah.
Lots of really cool jazz records happened there. And then, of course, they tore out the Neve and put another SSL in, and that was the end of that era.
It's kind of funny looking at that discography also, because you see all of these assisting gigs, and because of the nature of that kind of job, you got to work on all different kinds of styles and genres and stuff that you wouldn't necessarily be associated with you as a mixer today. You say maybe there's some embarrassing ones too, but then as you start to emerge as a mix engineer and a recording engineer in your own right, it was like certainly less jazz for a while and more rock. And is that what you wanted to be doing? Were you more of a rock head in your heart?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I love things that are loud, you know, and aggressive. I love, you know, guitar, bass, drums, rock music.
Yeah.
You know, I got into folk stuff with really beginning with the Avett Brothers, I suppose, and that sort of stuck. And now I love. I mean, I've always loved all sorts of music, because of my father and his love for jazz and 60s sort of pop and rock, things like that. He's got a really cool vinyl collection from back in the day, so definitely influenced by that. But I'm a child of the 80s, really, so I love 80s music and big reverbs and stuff like that. And then of course I went through the 90s with grunge and that sort of thing. So I have this sort of broad spectrum of music that I grew up with, and I love so much of it, and I also have this desire to not be pigeonholed into one type of music. I mean, I have several friends who just make the same record over and over and over again. Just plug in a different band, literally like the same drums, same guitars, same amps, and it's just like, all right, you get 5 takes of the song, and then we send it off to my Pro Tools guy, and he does this, and then this, and this, and this, and this, and it becomes again that sausage factory thing. And I hate that crap. I want to make records that are interactive, and it's really fun to take the music you love and sort of use that blueprint to make something different with the music that's in your hands. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So like I can take all this music that I've listened to over the years through all these different influences and then funnel that all down to what is literally in my hands on the faders at any given moment. And that is success to me.
Ryan Hewitt on what success is to him. Folks, success to me is knowing that you enjoy these Third Story podcast conversations. You can help by subscribing to the podcast at third-story.com or on iTunes. Of course, we often find ourselves at the crossroads of art and craft, or art and commerce, and there's so much subjectivity. I often wonder if there's ever a perfect version of any one thing. Is there a perfect guitar part? Is there a perfect drawing? Are there just variations on great? Is there, for example, such a thing as a perfect recording or a perfect mix? Here, Ryan and I discuss. Do you think that there is there a right mix? I mean, are there times when you say was the right way to mix that record or that song?
Well, it's a really interesting question because there's a lot of music that I enjoy that when I listen to it in the studio, it sounds like crap. Yeah. It's awful from a sonic perspective from what I would consider proper, but it's so good I wouldn't change it. And it's like, thank goodness I didn't mix that record. Maybe it wouldn't have been as visceral an experience for the listener had I done that. Mm-hmm. And maybe the dude in the band needed to mix the record in that bizarre manner with very odd balances and EQ choices to make that music attractive to me. Mm-hmm. Maybe had they given that to me to mix, I'm like, oh, this is a pile of crap. What is this?
I'm also thinking about, I was listening to the Lumineers record and just how they're so associated with and have been responsible for a lot of choices that other people make, like how wet they are. Literally just how wet the sound of that band is. Mm-hmm. I listened to some of your other mixes that you did in the same period of time. They're not as wet.
Oh, that was one of the challenges, because I'm not normally a big reverb guy. Working with Rick Rubin for so long, he's like allergic to reverb.
The anti-reverb,
It probably gives him hives. So for years, most of what I was doing was bone dry. Yeah. Like those Avett Brothers records, there's not an ounce of reverb on that stuff for the most part. There's one song that I felt compelled to throw Scott into a heavy plate reverb, and I played it for Rick, and he's like, why did you put reverb on this? I'm like, it just said it needed it to me. He's like, I want to hear it without reverb. Okay. I played it for him. He's like, 2 bars. He's like, stop. You were right. Stop. I can't hear it like that. The reverb's perfect. I just needed to hear it the other way. I'm like, cool. I'm glad someone agrees with my random sort of thing, because the rest of the record is dry.
There's no real explanation other than that it just asked for it.
I mean, when I put up a song to mix, I always listen to the rough mix to see where their head was at as far as vocal treatments go. But then I sort of just say, okay, well, that's what they wanted. What is it saying to me, having heard that? Mm-hmm. Is it too much, too little, too wet, too dry, too yellow, too green, too blue, whatever? The most time I spend on a mix is trying to find that vocal sound. Snare sound and vocal sound are the two sort of crucial elements to a rock song. Mm-hmm. Those are the two identifying sounds to me, and I think a lot about those things. And so with the vocal, there's all these different things you can try on it. And like this song I'm mixing right now, they're influenced by like Alt J and sort of some modern indie stuff, and I go and listen to those and like, all right, what's happening on these songs that they like so much? And they cited a few other things.
Would Bob Power or Michael Brower or Elliot Shiner listen to other contemporary mixers and evaluate them in the way that you do? Because you strike me as somebody who, going back to this idea of cherry-picking different techniques, is very interested in finding out what's going on.
I think that anybody who wants to keep up with the times and be the trendsetter has to know what's going on. You know, if you want to follow in the footsteps of other people, you listen in a certain manner. And if you want to be the leader, you listen in a different manner. I've been on sessions where people are like, I want to make it sound like this. And I'm like, well, that's already been done. And that was like, 5 years ago. Who cares about that? Let's do you. What do you sound like? What are you turned on by? But part of the art of producing is indulging certain, needs and wants from people who are not paid attention to.
So let's talk about that for a second, because you also mentioned Rick Rubin is in the context of how he likes to hear mixes, but Rick Rubin, who you worked a lot with, is a very mysterious figure. What is that relationship like? What is it like to work with Rick Rubin?
It's hard to describe. If you believe in the concept of a guru, of someone who is just like a sort of a spiritual guide, that's what he is in the studio. And it doesn't always work. Not everybody vibes with him in a good way. He pushes faders around, he knows what he wants to hear, and he can arrive there eventually. But he's a vibe guy, But he assembles the proper team to get the result that he wants. And, after producing how many hundreds of records, he knows how to do that really well. And knows when things aren't happening, knows when to move on, knows when to keep going, when to push, when to try to change things, when to take the artist outside on a walk down to the beach. It's a lot of hand-holding in that sense. And as far as, being the engineer or the mixer for him, it's actually a lot like remote recording. It's like have everything ready all the time, and then everything else that could possibly happen, be ready for that too. So, all right, we've got a band with bass, drums, guitar, some acoustics, some piano, some keyboards. Everything's got to be mic'd all the time. If there's an instrument in the room, it's got to be able to be recorded now. Hey, let's try a tambourine overdub. Hey, I got a U87 standing by over here. Hey, let's plug in that Wurlitzer. Cool. I got a direct box here. I got an amp there, mic'd up, all ready to go. So like my input sheets for those sessions are, 60 channels deep. But he just sort of shepherds things along. He's not the guy who's saying, all right, play this chord, this chord, this chord. It's going to be in this key, da-da-da-da, modulate, da-da-da-da. He's not a technical or musically educated person. Having a technical obstacle in a studio is like the biggest buzzkill ever. And I learned that not only from my dad, but from Jim Scott, who also came from remote recording. And so when we set up gigs together, he's like, just in the corner, couple 57s, couple 87s, couple DIs. And I was like, oh, that's kind of a genius idea. Just plug them in down at the end of the console. I don't care what they're in. That's genius.
Yes, that is genius.
So I always, always, always have spare stuff lying around.
Working with different engineers gives you, as you say, a way to cherry pick different techniques. What about producers? I mean, that's a whole other mysterious, huge part of the recipe of how this stuff gets done.
It is, and again, I've worked with like the diametric opposites of each other. I mean, like Rick Rubin being who he is and who I described, and then Jerry Finn on the other end, who was a musician, an engineer, a producer, a mixer of major records, and he was extremely slow and methodical. Like we'd spend half a day testing guitar cables. Cables. Rick Rubin doesn't give a shit about cables. Does it pass audio? Cool, done, problem solved. Jerry was like, I want to get the best possible guitar sound for this song today. And so we would mess around with cables, different guitars. He was obsessed with guitars. He had like over 100 guitars in his collection when he unfortunately passed away. Dozens and dozens of amps and snare drums and guitar pedals. He had a huge road case full of guitar pedals. Obsessed with like getting the perfect sound all the time. He was, click track guy. Let's play the drums. Now we play the guitars. Now we play the bass. Now we do the singing. Now we do the keyboards. Very methodical, but not sausage factory methodical. Yeah. It was highly dependent on the band that was in front of him, how all those things would go down and what the sounds were. But he would have like these little like, I only did 2 records with him, so it wasn't a huge variety. But he would have an ethos for a record, like the Alkaline Trio record he did. He's like, I always do like, multiple guitar cabinets with lots of mics and different preamps and all this stuff bust down. He's like, this record I want to do with 1 amp and 1 mic. Every sound is 1 amp, 1 mic. Nothing more complicated than that. I'm like, awesome. Let's do it.
Right, but to have an ethos is very helpful because it helps you to kind of understand what the identity of the project is going to be, right?
It helps you with the identity, and it also kind of narrows your options a little bit. You know, when we did the Blink-182 record, you know, we would typically have 2 amps, you know, through 2 guitar cabinets with, you know, 2 or 4 mics each. So now we're talking about 8 microphones to blend, you know, on his little BCM-10 console. And it's a lot of choices. It's a lot of, you know, not messing around because you're searching for that sound, and the combination of this mic and this mic means you don't have to EQ it. Not only is that kind of cool from a technical perspective, but it's like, let's get a tone, let's commit to this sound.
Yeah.
And a lot of people today don't understand that concept. They don't understand the idea of commitment on a number of levels, but we're just talking about music. You know, so I get tracks from people with, like, you know, each guitar part is 4 mics. And it's like, well, why did you do that? Oh, so you have options. I'm like, well, why didn't you just make the sound you want? Well, because I thought I'd leave it to you. I'm like, none of these mics sound good, which means you weren't listening. You just threw some mics up where someone said they sound good, and you recorded them all, and you didn't notice that they were out of phase or, you know, comb filtering because they're not in time alignment with each other.
So
you didn't spend any time
What
with
do you
that.
do given a situation like that?
I throw most of them away. I just pick the one that sounds the least bad
and work on,
and throw the rest of them away. I'm
Yeah.
like, you're wasting everyone's time. And you're creating a giant pile of stuff that I have to dig through in order to find what you were thinking on that particular day. To me, part of committing like that to a sound is not having to make the decision later. Part of that is if you make the decision at the moment you're recording it, that informs all the decisions you make subsequent to that. So now I know what my guitar sound is, for example. I know where my bass needs to sit, and I know where my vocal needs to sit, and I know where do I need a B3 on this song? Do I need a piano? Do I need more weight? Do I need more this, more that? Do I need an acoustic? Do I need 7 acoustics? You know, making these sort of what on the surface seems like a small decision is actually a massive decision going forward, because if you make all those little decisions as you go, it makes everything easier. It makes everything focused, and it makes everyone's job easier going forward.
Do you have assistants? Do you have people who assist you here?
Yeah, I've got a young assistant, Will DePerier, and I have a couple interns that hang out from time to time.
And how do you take your experience of having come up through the ranks and apply it to mentoring a new generation of people?
I just try to make it not sound like, you know, I had to walk uphill to school in the snow both ways, you know. I catch myself saying, like, well, you have it easy, and, you know, it's just like, don't be such an old curmudgeon.
Why do you think they have it easy?
Because everything's in the computer now. You know, they don't have to deal with aligning tape machines and synchronizing all these different sources and, you know, like drawing pictures of gear. You know, now we have digital cameras, and I've got this whole method of archiving pictures and renaming them properly, and, you know, I don't have a giant SSL console that you need to write the patch record down for every song every day. And yeah, it's just it's a lot simpler, and my process for certain is more streamlined. You know, I hold my assistants to a very high standard. I know that I'm probably not easy to work with. My previous assistant told Will that it was going to be a tough job, and, you know, and we sit down, you know, once every other week just to, you know, check in with each other and make sure that, you know, everything's cool, and, you know, and if I have an outburst or something, which is, you know, it's rare. I get impatient a lot, but outbursts rare. I always apologize and try to be cool and remember what it's like to be in that position and be the green guy, the young, you know, ambitious person. You know, but there's still a lot of crap to deal with in here. Maybe I should take that back, because it's not all that much easier, because, you know, replace having to do all the stuff I just talked about with having to keep up with software updates and Pro Tools sessions that come in all messed up that he's got to sort out and clean up and fix edits and all these other things. So I guess it's not, you know, if it is easier, it's only just.
But I also wonder what the result of, or the effect of, people coming in with their own sort of self-taught information, because we all have access to, you know, this kind of hodgepodge of stuff, right? I mean, and even as much as I obsessively into the night watch tutorial videos, and, you know, I wonder if there's as much danger in getting too deep into that as there is benefit in it.
Well, I mean, you know, everyone's got their own method to their madness. You know, everyone's got their own way of doing things, of hearing things, of manifesting their final outcome. None of those things is necessarily wrong.
Yeah.
You know, it's just a question of taste and style. And I think it's important for young people to develop a sense of taste and style. And again, in all things, not just in music. What you wear, what you drive, how you decorate your house, like all these things are style. And I notice some people are better at it than others, and some people just don't give a shit about anything other than their music, and they're slovenly and dirty and whatever else, and that I'll let them do their thing. I think that part of the job of mentoring someone is acting as the mythbuster, of them, some kid, I saw this on YouTube, whatever. I'm like, well, that's a preposterous idea, and here's why. Mm-hmm. Or like, I don't ever commit to this, and all these things, and all I can say is, well, this is how I do it. I've seen this, I do this, I like that, whatever. They're all just opinions. A mix is an opinion of a song. You give the same song to 10 different mixers, and it's going to come out in 10 different ways. But that's cool, and that's why you go to certain people. If you want it to sound like it's on the radio, you go to Chris Lord-Alge or Tom. If you want it to sound, arty and weird, you go to Dave Fridman or Chad Blake.
No kidding.
If you want it to sound like you come to me, because that's what I try to do.
Okay, well, I love that, because that is a real worldview. That's a real point of view. I want to take what you sound like and make more of that.
Yeah.
Make it sound like
the
best
again,
version of you. I know that by the time you worked with the Chili Peppers, you were a huge fan of the Red Hot Chili Peppers.
Yeah.
So you were going to go in with a certain amount of respect. Given that, maybe there's some new stuff that we can do, or but that's a total respect of what they stand for, what they sound like, what you love about them. Mm-hmm. Do you ever find yourself in a situation where you're working with a band or an artist who specifically wants to do something other than what they've done in the past? And how do you approach that?
I always make it a point to listen to things the band's done, just to see where they're coming from.
Yeah.
You sort of have to temper that with what they say they want, and what your instinct is. And so I sort of take those two things, instinct and what the band wants, I put that at the forefront of my thinking, and what they've done in the past sort of in the background.
Do you think about genre? I listened to this Harry Connick record that you did.
Harry, he's a jazz crooner by trade and by reputation, but he wanted to make more of like a Mark Ronson type record. Part of that record was like that, very pop programmed and whatnot, and then the other half was Butch Walker produced super organic dudes in a room, with no click and beautiful sounds and that sort of thing. So it was this juxtaposition of two very different production styles and two slightly competing genre identities on that record. So that was really interesting to work on. Again, you just have to sort of take your instinct and what the artist wants as the main idea for where you go with the mixes on that.
How often do you have to compete on a project? What do they call it? The mix shootouts?
Oh, the mix-offs and stuff like that. Well, it sort of depends on how I'm approached with it. If someone has no idea what they want, I'm not interested. If they know what they want and they just want to see how my mix would sound compared to Andrew Shepp's and some other people, I'm interested. Do you want that for free? Not so interested. Mm-hmm. It's like at this point I've mixed, 100 records. Go listen to them. Have a listen to what I can do across multiple genres and across multiple years, and you'll see what my tendencies are. And same for Andrew and all these other guys. I mean, we've all been around the block and done things. I'm thankful for mix-offs because that's what my career was built on when I won the Chili Peppers mix-off.
Is that how that happened?
Yeah. So Rick is notorious for having mix-offs, even amongst guys he's worked with dozens of times. But at that point, I hadn't done anything for Rick. I hadn't mixed anything for him, and the band insisted, John Frusciante in particular, insisted that I be included in the mix-off after engineering a bunch of the record. But I was not developed at all as a mixer. I knew a lot about what to do, but I didn't have a ton of experience at that point. And that was really difficult. So that was really, but it's also incredibly fun and inspiring.
Even today, if you do get a mix where somebody wants to hear how you would approach this assignment, is there any element within that sort of competitive spirit that makes you push yourself any differently or approach it any differently?
Sure. The first song for an artist I spend a lot of time on, just trying to figure out what the identity is, what the groove, where the groove is, who's important, what the sort of sonic palette is going to be on this record. And I always push myself really hard on test mixes. There's one I spent 3 days on, and I didn't get the gig, and I was livid because the guy they picked did a really mediocre job on the album. And so that sort of turned me off of doing it, because you have to have certain rules when you have a mix-off. And that the first rule of Fight Club is that you can't know whose mix is whose. And you need an outside, uninterested party to make sure that all the mixes are level matched and that they're all anonymized.
So you're not worried about level when you're delivering a mix?
Well, no, I mean, I make my mixes loud.
Yeah.
But, what if one's half a dB louder than the other one? You're naturally going to gravitate towards that
Yes.
to a certain degree.
Yes.
So with the Chili Peppers mixes, everyone's mixes went through one of Rick's engineers who wasn't in the race to make sure they were level matched, and he put them in an anonymous order on a CD, burned CDs for everybody to listen to, and that's how it went down. So they were like, I think mixer 3 is the best on the first and second song. I think mixer 5 is the best on the third song. And so
it was 3 songs.
It was 3 songs, and so I won 2 out of 3 and got the gig. And then Andrew won the other song. And when it became clear we weren't going to make our deadline, they're like, all right, let's get Andrew in here to mix the rest of the, to start mixing in parallel with you so we can get this done quicker.
You talk about doing a test mix that was 3 days, and, that's obviously long. Generally, is there a rule of thumb? Is it a day a mix?
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty much a song a day guy.
How do you know when your mix is done? How do you arrive at that?
That's the $1 million question. That's something you learn with experience, because if it's done and you keep going, you mess it up. You ruin it. It's like overbaking a cake or overcooking a steak. You ruin what could have been amazing had you stopped at the right moment and paid attention to when it was done, when you need to take that cake out or the steak off the grill. If you're not paying attention, you miss it, and then you can't get back to that place. Doesn't, even if with all this recall and session file backups and stuff, you can't get back there. So it's crucial to know when you're done, and it's better to stop early. Like, I think this is done. Let me play it for the artist, because they're going to know.
Oh man, that is so fantastic what he just said. If you're not paying attention, you miss it. It reminds me of that scene in 6 Degrees of Separation where they talk about elementary school art teachers knowing when to take the pictures away from students. It's just a question of knowing when to stop. Folks, I am not ready to stop making episodes of The Third Story. I think we still have more steak to grill, but you can help me. Help me feed you steak. Subscribe, tell your friends, share it on social media, leave a review. Eat steak. Of course, while we all love to eat our meals, not everyone wants us to see how the meal gets made. In this, our final segment, Ryan talks about why he doesn't let clients in the room while he's mixing.
I have a policy of not allowing anyone in the room when I'm mixing.
Wherever you are.
Wherever I am.
Yeah.
Not allowed. Sorry.
Until you're ready to play it.
Until I'm ready to play it. Because, I'll be experimenting with things that might be really bad on the way to something really great.
Yeah.
I may be focused on one thing and not paying attention to the other, and then the guy sitting back there, you gotta get to that thing, you gotta come, fix that! And they'll sit there tweaking out and getting all upset.
Yeah.
And really have this emotional charge to things. Or they'll just be fatigued sitting in here for so long, and all these little micro changes I'm making contribute to a macro change at the end of the day, but they don't notice because they're here listening to all this stuff.
Yeah.
So they need to go off and have a nice day roaming around town and, having a nice lunch or seeing their friends or whatever, and then I can call them at 6 o'clock and say, hey, come on down, I got a song for you.
Yeah.
And they'll sit here, they can be focused and ready to go. They'll hear it fresh for the first time, and that's when they're going to have the immediate reaction of, yes, no, this needs to change, I love this, don't change that, vocal needs to come up in the second verse, very specific comments, particularly if they've been around this a lot, and sometimes maybe I don't get it, maybe the song is not right, and they're like, oh no, this, I was thinking more of this and less this, and it's like, okay, give me half an hour, and I can go back and restructure things and change what I need to change to make them happy.
For people that you see that are starting to do this now, what do you think are the biggest mistakes that you see?
The biggest mistake, I think, is thinking you know something.
I guess you sort of said it. People don't make choices, right? People aren't willing to make choices. And it reminds me of something that both Al Schmidt and James Farber said to me when I interviewed them. They're much more organic kind of come from a similar philosophy, which is if they've recorded something, by the time they mix it, I mean, Schmidt says 0 EQ and ideally no compression, and Farber's not far behind, unless it's something that they didn't record. And in both cases, they said, if I didn't record it, I absolutely have no problem turning every dial until I get it to sound the way I want it to sound.
Right. Well, see, I think that's a trap. I mean, Al and James are two of the most experienced engineers on the planet.
Yeah.
But that said, thinking your shit doesn't stink is not embracing the possibility that it does. Nothing frustrates me more than my own recordings, to be perfectly honest.
Okay, so what does that mean? That's
because I know where all the bodies are buried. I know what I wish I had done better. And maybe when I'm 80 years old, I won't be making mistakes. But I'm always trying to push myself and do something different. I'm not miking things exactly the same every time. And, to be fair, if I'm making a jazz record, it's automatically has to sound a certain way. If they're calling Al, they're calling Al because he does things in the classic fashion.
Which, I have to say as a side note, I totally agree with until I listened to Toto or some records that he made, and he, according to him, made them the same way he makes everything else.
Right.
And I don't understand how they sound the way they sound, knowing what I know about how he works.
That's a collection of the most incredible rock musicians in the world, in one of the best studios on the planet. I mean, he was using 251s in the toms.
Yeah.
I'm not as good as Al, definitely, clearly. But, if I could record those guys, I think it would sound pretty darn good. Put the proper microphone in the right place, and of course you don't have to use EQ.
Yeah.
It's not necessary. But that said, the requirements and the acceptable sounds of today are very different than they were when Toto 4 was made in 1982. I mean, it's a beautiful sounding record, and it's one of my benchmark recordings. I mean, Africa is one of the most gorgeous sounding things ever made. But, does that translate to how records are made today?
There's just certain expectations that the listeners have today.
Yeah, totally.
That let them know that this is a new record.
Totally. I mean, that Toto record is a very organic, natural, airy, open-sounding, beautiful record. I mean, it's sort of fallen out of fashion to a degree, but it doesn't make it any less legitimate. I'm sort of talking in circles right now.
Well,
but just thinking aloud about this conundrum, because, you can make a big, beautiful, organic-sounding record, but is it going to get on the radio now?
But the Avett Brothers, for example, I think that those are very organic-sounding records. They're clearly contemporary. I can't put my finger on exactly what makes it contemporary. I listened to the mix. I think you probably could have mixed it with a lot of the same thinking 15 years ago. And yet there are still enough choices that have been made that tell you this is a contemporary record.
The space you put things in maybe is a good indicator of what era it is. I mean, everything in the 80s had that awful Yamaha and Lexicon reverb all over it. You think of what's that Bruce Springsteen song, Dance in the Dark, with the massive snare reverb, where apparently Bruce just kept saying, I can't hear it, turn it up, more, I can't hear it. And then all of a sudden you wind up with this thing, there's more reverb than snare.
Yeah.
In the 70s it was dead, boxy sounding stuff. In the 60s it was big plate reverbs. So you have, that's certainly a marker of time. Now it's like a distorted reverb is the thing to use.
There are certain indicators that tell you this is for you. This is new, and it's for, as a young listener or as a contemporary listener, this is now something that's been made for you today.
Yeah, it's really interesting to think about that, because people say, I want it to sound modern. All right, well, what's modern? I mean, you can look at architecture, and you can look at painting, and you can place those things in... You can look at cars, and you can place those things in a very distinct era, in the sort of lineage of their development. You can look at Bauhaus architecture as opposed to neoclassical or Baroque or Art Deco.
Yeah.
All these different eras in different places are very identifiable, and then those influence the next thing, and so goes the music.
But the interesting thing is, in neither case is it progressing towards better necessarily. It's just changing. I went through a thing recently with my dad's new record where I got totally hung up on the 70s, and particularly the way the kick drum and the bass was mixed on his records in the 70s, and I really started thinking about how to do that. And I really tried to get that sound again without trying to be totally throwback, but also think God, they heard it different. They just heard it differently.
Well, the stereo systems they were listening to were different. They didn't have earbuds. They barely had stereo at that point in the 70s. That was a whole new thing.
Yeah.
Car stereos were not high fidelity. So you had to bring all these things across in a stereo system that may not go below 100 hertz or above 5K. So you're sort of bandwidth limited to where you need to put stuff.
Yes.
Phonograph records couldn't reproduce super low bass or super high treble.
So this does then speak to what makes something modern, which is that there's more range. And, like when I talked to James Farber, one of the things he talked about was the mistakes that were made in early digital because people brought their analog habits with them into the digital realm.
It's really funny to think to listen to those records that were mixed on early digital tape machines in the late 80s and how bright and oppressive they are, and how there's no bottom end because they were leaning on the tape machine for the mix down to give them the bottom end. And it's funny because I started analog, went digital, and now I'm printing my mixes to a 1/4-inch Studer again, and I'm upset with it when it's got little bumps in the frequency response. I'm like, no, you're supposed to. Oh yeah, that's right.
It's tape.
Right. But it's so nice. It doesn't always work.
Right.
It's not always awesome, but the times that it does work, like on a lot of this rock stuff I'm mixing recently, it sounds amazing, and I'm really, really happy about it.
And you can't get there in the box.
I mean, maybe you could, but there's just something to it. There's something to a physical medium.
As much as we glorify tape today, it's like a pain in the ass. You really don't want to always work that way.
It's a commitment, man.
Yeah.
It goes back to that same thing. You have to commit to working in that realm and all the limitations that come with it. It's a pain in the ass in so much as, you have to wait for it to rewind, and you only have a certain number of tracks, and if you erase something, it's gone forever. People like tape for the sound, and there are other people who like tape for the limits it places on what you can and cannot do.
Yeah.
And that, to me, forces more creativity. It forces more focus, more attention on the process, certainly than working in Pro Tools.
Do you feel like you can do your best work outside of this environment, the environment that you've set up for yourself, or do you think that this room is optimized for you to be your most Ryan Hewitt self?
Well, it's optimized in so much as everything's where I want it all the time, and I have the tools that I like using. I mean, there's always things you want to buy, and things you want to try. But I know the sound of this room. I know its deficiencies and its benefits, and my method of my workflow I've sort of refined over the last, however many years. I've had this set up more or less for 8 or 9 years, and I've got a flow to how I do things, and it just works. I mean, I mixed a song in LA the other day on an old Neve console, and
what was it like?
It was a little frustrating. It was actually the room I came up in at East West, which was cello at the time in LA. It was cool, but then I was just like, I turned to do something, and I was like, oh, I can't I sort of painted myself into a corner, but it's like, okay, well, I got to find another way of doing that. So it forced me to do something else, and then I'm like, I don't know, does this sound good? I think this sounds good. You reference it to something you mixed before, and it's like, yeah, this sounds good, cool. I'm there. But we used to, and a lot of people still do, go into this studio today and that studio tomorrow to mix a record, and I've always wanted to have my own place. When I was bouncing around to different places, I just had my method. I'd make things as familiar as possible given the circumstances.
Right.
And, I used to have this naive idea of like, well, this record needs to be mixed on an SSL, and this one really needs to be mixed on a Neve. And that's when people gave a shit and had money to pay for studios. And now everyone's like, well, I just need an all-in price. Tell me how much this whole record's going to cost to mix. Mm-hmm. And now that I have my own place, I can say, this is the number for the whole song, for the whole record, And here's 10 other records I've mixed here in the last year.
You reached a point in LA where you said, I'm not as successful as I want to feel. I know you haven't been in Nashville that long, and so maybe it's not a fair question, but do you feel as successful as you wanted to feel then, and what does that mean to you today?
Success to me feels like I have a balance in my life, that I'm working with the people who I want to work, I am doing good work consistently in a space that's mine, and I can go home to my girlfriend and my dog and sit on my couch in a house that I own and think about what I'm going to do in the yard on the weekend. Mm-hmm. If you're working to live, it's kind of boring, and time flies by before you know it. You're like retired, and then what? You're gonna do this shit when you're 80? I mean, yes, I will do this stuff when I'm 80 as well, but I want to like have some fun now. Mm-hmm. While I'm still youngish.
I think working to live is such an interesting dilemma also because The question is, can you love it as much if you're doing it because you need to do it to survive?
It does make it makes it challenging, and it makes it, maybe you get a little resentful of it sometimes, like, you go back to, like, my dad not saying no to things. I want to be able to say no to things. Like, if this doesn't jive with my thing, whatever part that is, I don't want to do it. I turned down a gig a couple years ago because of political affiliations of the artist. I'm like, that guy is a lunatic. I mean, his music is unbelievable, and I've loved it since I was a kid, but I'm not working with that guy. And I'm gonna exercise my option to say no.
Well, Ryan, thank you for exercising your option to say yes to this conversation today.
Well, I love nothing more than talking about what we do and trying to spread the gospel of making great records.
That's very cool. Well, thanks for spreading it around.
Absolutely.
There it was, Ryan Hewitt. Take the steak off the grill. Stay in the box, but think outside of it at the same time. Coming out of the tradition, blazing new ground, making modern sounds, making classic sounds, embracing limitation, taking the dog for a walk. If you like this one, you might enjoy previous conversations with James Farber, Al Schmidt, or Butch Vig. I'll be back next week with another great one. Until then, I'll talk to you soon.